Towards the end of the fourth Perek, this is where Boaz gathers 10 people, and Boaz basically tells Tov, Ploni Almoni, his uncle, that Naomi has a field that she wants to sell according to Rashi, but you have to marry Ruth. So Ploni Almoni refuses, and we were masber yesterday exactly what gives Naomi the right to put such a condition, because if she didn't sell the field yet, she could put whatever condition she wants. If she already sold the field, then it's not within her power to make any limitation. I also want to point out, so that's one reason why Rashi says machra means she wants to sell. There's actually another reason why Rashi says it as well, because the halacha is that when you sell somebody a field in Eretz Yisrael, when there's Yovel, you have to give them at least 2 years before you redeem the field. Now Naomi, this is within a year. This is within a few months of Naomi returning. If she actually sold the field, it wouldn't be shayach to redeem the field anyway, because 2 years haven't passed. So these are two different reasons why Rashi has to learn that machra means she wants to sell the field, but not that she actually sold it. Okay. So Ploni Almoni says, no, I'm not going to marry Ruth. And yesterday we went through all the different reasons why he didn't want to marry Ruth. So what is the next step? So after Ploni Almoni says no, la yuchal ligoli, so the pasuk says, v'zais lefanim b'Yisrael. This was an ancient tradition. Lefanim. This was an ancient, already in Shmuel's time, this was an ancient tradition b'Yisrael, al ha'geula v'al ha'tamura, on redeeming things and on substituting things. We'll have to, of course, keep in mind this is there's a very, very famous sefer by the Satmar Rebbe that is taka called al ha'geula v'al ha'tamura. So somebody says, "Oh, Shmuel Hanavi is borrowed from the Satmar Rebbe." No, obviously it's the opposite situation. Geula and Tzmura literally means on redemption and on its substitute. So this was his book about anti-Zionism, ala Geula. People think it's Geula, but really it's a Tzmura. But in the context here, this pasuk is not talking about Zionism. We'll see what it is talking about. But it says, if there was Geula or if there was Tzmura, I'll come back to those terms. L'kayem kol davar, to fulfill anything. Shalaf ish nalai, a man would take off his shoe, v'nasan l're'eyu, and would give it to his friend. It doesn't say who's removing whose shoe. V'zayis ha'te'uda b'Yisrael, this was the tradition in Yisrael. And based on that parenthetical note, the next pasuk says, v'yayimer ha'gayel l'bayaz, the Redeemer says to Boaz, Knei lach, acquire this. Vayishleif nalai, and he took off his shoe. The statement, he took off his shoe, is very unclear. Boaz took off Boaz's shoe? Ploni Almoni took off Ploni Almoni's shoe? Or Ploni Almoni took off Boaz's shoe? Or Boaz took off Ploni Almoni's shoe? There are four combinations, right? So who took off whose shoe? So I want to clarify one point. A lot of people read this pasuk and they immediately think of chalitza. They think, Ploni Almoni is given an opportunity to marry Ruth, and he doesn't want to do what I call spiritual yibam. No, there's a ceremony called chalitza. So this is a chalitza, so to speak, because he doesn't want to be miyabim Ruth. Many people think that, but that's vadai tais. In other words, this has nothing to do with chalitza, and I'll give you two reasons why it has nothing to do with chalitza. First of all, let's imagine you have two brothers. And the Mishnah says in Yevamos that the older brother, mitzvah begadol, the older brother has the right to do yibam. If the older brother says no, we go to the next brother. Now, if the older brother says no, but there's somebody else who's going to do yibam, you don't need chalitza. Chalitza is only needed when nobody is doing the mitzvah of yibam. Let me just see it. Yeah, when nobody is doing the mitzvah of Yibam, when another person is doing the mitzvah of Yibam, there's no chalitza. So here, if Pliny Almighty is declining Yibam, but it's going to go to Bayaz, you don't need chalitza. That's one thing. The second reason why it can't be chalitza, at least in the way Chazal understand it, is if it would be chalitza, then the shoe that you would be removing is you would be removing the shoe from Pliny Almighty. Right, that's what chalitza is. The guy who doesn't do Yibam, you take off the shoe. And who would remove it? The Yavama. So if it would have said Ruth took off Pliny Almighty's shoe, no, so that could be chalitza. But it doesn't say Ruth did it. I mean, whoever did it, whichever way you understand it, says one man took off the shoe from the other man. That's not chalitza. In fact, according to chalitza, even if the Yavama would make a shaliach to take off the shoe, it wouldn't be valid. Chalitza cannot be done through shaliach, either on the part of the man or the part of the woman. So Chazal understands that we are not talking about chalitza here. We are talking about Kinyan Chalipin. Now, Kinyan Chalipin, or Kinyan Sudar, as it's sometimes called, is a Maisa Kinyan that is done by what you might call barter. It's a symbolic barter. So let's take a very simple example. Let's imagine that I want to sell you my car. Now, technically, even if you gave me money for the car and I took the money, the halacha is metaltal and movable property does not pass over by kesef. I mean, this is an important rule. If I give you money, mice are not kaineh, which means, according to halacha, I have the right to change my mind, and you have the right to change your mind, although it's brought down that once money was given, if you change your mind, there is a curse called Mi Shapara, that God that paid back the Dor HaMabul for dishonesty will pay back a person who reneges on a deal after he's given money. But with the curse, you have the right to change your mind. So money is not kaina by metaltalim. By land, you can be kaina karka, bekesef, by giving money, by shtar, by receiving a deed, or chazaka, by doing some work on the land, like you dig something or whatever it is. That's kesef, shtar, chazaka. That's only true for karka. But for metaltalim, kesef is not kona, and you need something else. So there are a number of ways you could be kaina metaltalim. Not all of them are going to work for a car. You could be kaina by hagba, you lift something up. But unless you're Shimshon or Superman, that's usually not going to work for a car. There is Mashicha. You move it. It's interesting. Could be that driving the car might be a Kinyan Mashicha. Or there's an all-purpose Kinyan called Chalipin, symbolic barter, which means if I give money, that's a Kinyan Kesef. I'm not kaina with that. But if I give a handkerchief, a pen, a kli, a shoe, and I say, by my giving you this shoe, the pen, the kli, whatever it is, you're makne me, the other thing, that's called Kinyan Chalipin, a Kinyan of exchange, a Kinyan of barter. Now, it's interesting, it's a little confusing, because if I give you a kli, there are theoretically two different kinyanim I might be doing. I might be kaina bekesef, because shava kesef is kekesef. But that's not going to work by metaltalim, because by metaltalim you cannot be kaina bekesef. Or I'm kaina with a new kinyan that is called chalipin, which is, chalipin means a symbolic barter. It's often called Kinyan Sudar for whatever reason. It was common in the time of the, although here it says shoe, I'll get to where the shoe comes from. But it was common that they would use a sudar. Now a sudar we translate as handkerchief. Actually a sudar is not a handkerchief. A sudar is like a turban that has like a scarf hanging down from it. For some reason they translate it as a handkerchief, although it is not a handkerchief. Okay, so this is called Kinyan Chalipin. Now Kinyan Chalipin is actually a very powerful Kinyan. Kinyan Chalipin works both for karka and for metaltalim. And in fact, Kinyan Chalipin can transfer things that otherwise cannot be transferred at all, such as a loan. Let's assume somebody owes me money. Somebody owes me money. And I want to sell the loan. I want to sell at a discount. Right? If I'm entitled to collect $1,000, right, this is a major market. in securities. I have either a promissory note or even a milva al peh with witnesses. Somebody owes me $10,000, but I need cash right away. So I have the right to sell my debt to somebody else at a discount for state. So somebody will pay me, $6,000 to be able to collect $4,000. $10,000, the extra $4,000. Now, there is a whole shaila. How do you sell a loan? What kinyan do you have for a loan? So if it's a shtar, if it's a loan, that's evidenced by a promissory note. So you can actually do it by transferring, by physically giving the shtar and writing another shtar, meaning I write on another piece of paper, I am selling you this shtar. That's called ksiva u'mesira. But if it's a milva al peh, meaning it's a loan, but I don't have a shtar. Again, today that would be very uncommon, but the Gemara talks about it, right? It's a loan that doesn't have a shtar, but I have two witnesses. And you're willing to buy my milva al peh because the witnesses will testify for you. There is actually no real mechanism to transfer a milva al peh. It's not shayach meshicha, it's not shayach hagbah. What maisa kinyan? Money is not going to be kaina, right? Because a milva al peh is not karka. The answer is the primary way, maybe the only way, you transfer a milva al peh is through Kinyan Chalipin, Kinyan Sudar. So what would that mean? That would mean if you're the creditor that is owed $10,000, and I'm willing to buy this loan for, let's say, $6,000, I give you a sudar, I give you a kli, I give you a shoe, I give you a pen. And by my giving you the kli, b'tayras chalipin, I have now acquired the milva al peh. Okay, so chalipin is a very versatile kinyan. It works for karka, it works for metaltalim, and it works for what we might call intangible property, such as a milva. Now, because of this, because chalipin works with intangible property, you can use it whenever you're renouncing rights. If you have a right, a zechus, to do something, and you're giving up your zechus, and the other side wants to be sure that you're not going to change your mind, so they do a kinyan chalipin, so you're transferring your zechus. So that is what is actually going on here. Pliny Almaini has certain zechuyas. He has the right to redeem this field that Naomi, well, technically it's not redemption technically, but when Naomi is going to sell, he has the right to be the first buyer. That's a zechus that he has. He also has a zechus, if he so wanted, to marry Ruth based on what we call spiritual yibam. He is declining the exercise of those rights. He wants to give the right to Bayaz. But Bayaz wants to be sure, if Plenty of Money would simply say, hey, go ahead, he might change his mind a second later. So in order to make this an irrevocable foregoing of zechuyas, what Bayaz, this is how Chazal understand it, Bayaz took off his shoe. I'll come back to why shoe. He took off his shoe. Bayaz took off Bayaz's shoe. He gave it to Pliny Almaini, and B'tayras Kinyan Chalipin, Pliny Almaini transferred to Bayaz his zechus to redeem the field and his zechus to be miyabim. Now again, as far as the halacha is concerned, shoe is not important. I mean, obviously the pasuk says shoe is important. We'll get to it. But in terms of halacha, the only requirement for a kinyan chalipin is that it be a kli. It be a usable. Now, a shoe is a kli. You put your foot in it. But again, in terms of the kinyan, it didn't have to be a shoe. It could be a kli. It can't be money. Money cannot be chalipin. But the chalipin could be a sudar, could be a beged, could be a garment, could be anything that's usable. For reasons I'll mention in a few moments, the minhag was in those days that it was a shoe. So understand what's going on here. So according to the halacha, again, there's different opinions in the Gemara. According to the halacha, it was Bayaz that took off Bayaz's shoe, gave it to Pliny Almaini, in exchange of which Pliny Almaini was mevater on his zechus to be a redeemer, both in terms of buying the field and in terms of marrying Ruth. Now, it bothers me a little bit that given the fact that Bayaz was going to do both of these things instantaneously, in other words, I understand if Bayaz was going to do this in a month, so Bayaz wants to guarantee that Pliny Almaini doesn't change his mind. So you need a Kinyan. A Kinyan is an irrevocable transfer. But if Bayaz is going to marry her right now and buy the field right now, what exactly is he afraid of? I mean, Pliny Almaini certainly cannot be chayzer once Bayaz was kaina the field. Well, maybe I'm not sure. Now that I'm speaking it out loud. I mean, let's imagine there wouldn't have been. Let's imagine that Bayaz would not have done a Kinyan. Okay, let's assume Bayaz simply said, "Oh, okay, plenty of money. You don't want to do it? I'll take care of it." So Bayaz is kind of the field, even though he's not the closest relative. What if Pliny Almaini says the next week, I do want to buy the field, and I'll even marry Ruth. Could Pliny Almaini have made such a decision after the Maisa? It's not mistavra. It's not mistavra. What, he's going to make Bayaz divorce Ruth? I mean, what's going to be? So I have a little bit of a kasha that it's not clear to me why there was a nechitzas, why there was a need for this Kinyan, given the fact that Bayaz is going to act right away. It could be, in that sense, even though this is a halachic Kinyan, to be sure, but it could be that this was just done for a formality, meaning to say that Pliny Almaini shouldn't say later, "Oh, I was forced into it, I didn't really think about it." It's a way of making somebody think twice, meaning to say, somebody says, "Sure, go ahead." So when I say back, "Let's do a Kinyan," that makes the guy rethink that this is a serious deal, which means Kinyanim have halachic validity, but they also have symbolic validity, because they make a person realize that this is not a joke, this is a real thing. So perhaps, I don't know, I didn't see it beferish, but perhaps the Kinyan here was primarily so that Pliny Almaini shouldn't say later, "I was kind of cheated, I was deceived," and the like. Although, I'll tell you the truth, I mentioned to you a Pischei Tshuva. According to Pischei Tshuva, even with the Kinyan, Pliny Almaini has a taina. If you remember, the Pischei Tshuva has a shaila. He brings from, Pischei Tshuva is always from other sources. He brings from different achrayim. Shaila, let's say that a certain person has a sechus, has a priority to do a certain mitzvah. But he doesn't know he has the priority. So the halacha is, you don't have to tell him. In other words, you can do the mitzvah without telling him, because you're not mechuyev to give him information. You can't lie to him, but you're not mechuyev to give him information that will cause you to lose the mitzvah. And the Pischei Tshuva brings a raya, because that's how he learns what happened here. Bayaz is going to announce that you can marry female Moabites. But Pliny Almaini, again, he's learning like Rashi, doesn't know this halacha. So, and Bayaz doesn't tell him, meaning Bayaz does not announce, as he says to Pliny Almaini, he says, "Oh, you got to marry Ruth." Pliny Almaini says it's usher, thinking that Bayaz doesn't know the din. Well, Bayaz does not correct him by saying females are mutter, he just chaps around. So the emes is, according to the Pischei Tshuva, Bayaz was, not Bayaz, Pliny Almaini was cheated, was deceived. Again, not like the Brisker Rav. So I'm not sure if the Kinyan makes it any better under those circumstances. I mean, I'm learning the Kinyan is, so Pliny Almaini shouldn't have some claim. He has a claim either way, that he only gave it up because he didn't know the halacha. But again, as I say, we went through other pshatim yesterday that in fact he knew the halacha, but he either thought it was from a drasha or he was worried about his kids. So according to that, he wasn't deceived. But the Pischei Tshuva learns that Pliny Almaini was in fact deceived. Yeah.
Would Pliny keep Boaz's shoe? Is it an actual
Okay, so all right, so that depends between the parties. I mean, technically, the shoe belongs to Pliny Almaini at this point. The minhag was you gave it back. You know, what's the old joke about don't judge somebody till you walked a mile in his shoes. You know, so I walked a mile away and he doesn't have his shoes, so I can judge him now. But presumably you give it back to. Now, let me just remind you where if you've been at a chasna or you had a chasna, so you may have seen this as well, right? Before Adam sign on a ksuva, right? The chassan is obligating himself to all the obligations of the ksuva. That's both the obligations of marriage, to support your wife, etc., and the obligations, God forbid, in the event of death or divorce, right? The chassan is makabel his chayvus. So one of the ways you create an obligation, which is an intangible thing, is by Kinyan Chalipin. So technically, what should happen is, since the chassan owes these obligations to his wife, the literal tzura of a Kinyan Chalipin would be the wife would give a shoe or a pen or whatever it is to the husband, and by the husband picking up the pen, the husband is now obligating himself to the ksuva. Technically, that's what would be. Our minhag is that the wife does not do this. In fact, depending when they sign the ksuva, husband and wife chassan and kala have not been seeing each other. So what you have is the edim, or the Mesader Kedushin, who is acting, I'm sure you understand this, as a shaliach for the wife, in which we give the husband an object of value, a kli, has to be a kli, and by the husband lifting up the kli, he becomes chayav in the ksuva. That is what? Kinyan Chalipin. Kinyan Chalipin gives right. And so people always get mixed up a little bit, like who's giving what to whom, but you understand what's happening here. The witnesses, or the Mesader Kedushin, it makes no difference, as a shaliach of the wife, are giving a kli to the husband. Theoretically, the husband now owns that kli. Theoretically, he doesn't have to give it back, but usually it's just given back. But that's not part of the actual ceremony itself. Yeah.
In the case of Boaz, it seemed like the buyer was giving an object of his own to the seller.
Yeah.
In this wedding case, it's the other way around. It wasn't the husband buying the obligation of the wife.
No, because the ksuva are the obligations of the husband to the wife. In the ksuva, there are no obligations. A wife may have obligations, but the ksuva doesn't contain them. The ksuva are what a husband is giving to his wife. So he might be buying a wife, Isha Niknas, I understand that, but she's buying her zechuyos under the ksuva, and therefore she has to give him an object. Now listen, he'll give her an object of value under the chuppah. He'll give her that. That's a separate thing, which is not chalipin technically, that's kinyan kesef, but okay.
Yeah. When you're just relinquishing rights or giving rights to lawyers?
It's mashma, he's giving rights. He's makne. He's makne zechuyos. He's makne. Yeah. He's makne because mechila. Yeah. Well, that's actually another kasha. L'chayra, bayaz would seem to have rights even through mechila, and mechila doesn't need a ma'isa kinyan. That's a kasha. Okay. That's another kasha. Okay. So this is what's going on, right? This is what's going on now. In terms of halacha, any kli is good. It has to be a kli. Can't be money. It has to be a kli. Okay, beseder. Can't be karka. Chalipin has to work with kli, kalim. But it does emphasize, and apparently in Shmuel Hanavi's time, they already weren't using a shoe. You see, that's why he has to be makdim. I'm going to tell you about Boaz removing his shoe. So now that's going to be strange because we don't do that today. So the pasuk says in parentheses, the old custom among Jews used to be that he would remove a shoe, which means it was already an obsolete custom by the time of Shmuel, right? That's why he has to say the reader wouldn't know what's going on with the shoe, right? So it did get replaced, but the Medrash says that the symbolism of a shoe in the ancient world, not only among Yidden, but among Yidden as well, having shoes was a sign of freedom, because shoes meant mobility. I could go where I needed to go. Slaves who were stuck to a certain location, as a sign of their slavery, often went barefoot. That's why it's brought down in the Medrash that when Yosef was sold by his brothers, so the brothers took the money and they bought shoes. So they're darshaning a pasuk in Amos. They bought na'alayim, etc. Al michram b'kesef tzadik. They sold for money a tzaddik ve'evyain. They sold a poor, impoverished person bavur na'alayim for shoes. So Chazal darshan that pasuk. Although the pasuk is not directly talking about Mechiras Yosef, but they darshan it by Mechiras Yosef. So the notion of a kinyan is essentially symbolically expressing the idea, I am at your service, meaning to say, I want to get something from you. So I'm basically taking off my shoe by kind of acknowledging that you are my master. And therefore, I am taking this only by your rishus and by your authorization. So it's not a chelek of the Etzem Kinyan Chalipin, but it was a symbolic subservience, as if Boaz is honoring Pliny Almighty by giving him his shoe. The minhag, again, it fell out of vogue, maybe because people weren't giving back the shoe, I don't know, whatever, but they stopped doing it, and al pi halacha it only has to be a kli. Okay? Now, having said all this, to show that this has no shaykhus to chalitza, nevertheless, you have to understand something in Lashon HaMikra, the way Tanakh works. And that is, sometimes something will be described, but Lashon will be used that is evocative, to make you think of something else. The Nitzif says, this is why Torah, although this is not Torah, but this is why Torah is called a shira. Torah is called a song. Actually, shira doesn't mean song, it means poetry. And why is Torah called poetry? Kisvu lachem, write down the shira. Torah is called shira. So the Nitzif says, because just like poetry is written in such a way in which it may have a primary meaning, but it uses other words to make you think of something else, so too in the Torah there is a pshat, but the lashon that the Torah uses will give you associations with other things. That's the tzura of shira. So the emesis, it's vaday also the case for Nevi'im and Kesuvim, maybe even more so on some level, that certain lashonos are going to be used to put a picture or an image in your mind, even though that's not the actual pshat of what's going on. So what's going on here is not chalitza. What's going on here is Boaz taking off his shoe and giving it to a Pliny Almighty in order to be kaina, the right of redemption and the right of marrying of Ruth. And this is Kinyan Chalipin. But the language is ambiguous. It doesn't say who took off whose shoe. And the image, and this is why people make a mistake, the image a person has is chalitza. So it is not wrong to say that the Navi is Merames here, that Pliny Almighty turned down a great, great opportunity to make him shame, to perpetuate. And really, in retrospect, this was a momentous mistake, because Zarei Shel Mashiach, I mean, turning down marrying Ruth is not just, I could have had a nice shidduch. Mashiach comes from this union. Pliny Almighty kind of took himself out of history in that particular way. So I do think it's not a choice to say that there's an evocative association with chalitza from the lashon hagam that this is not chalitza. Now you'll remember, I pointed this out earlier as well, when Ruth comes to Boaz in the middle of the night, so it says she lays by his feet and she uncovers his feet. He has a blanket. Once again, she's kind of reminding him, you have chiyuvim, you have an obligation. You don't want to do it. It's like you're despising your brother, like the chalutza, right? Uncovering. So the point is that there are what you might call poetic secondary associations of chalitza, even though actual chalitza is not being described. And that is a legitimate tool to use when you're looking at psukim, you're looking at the pictures, the images. That's why the Nitziv says, as I said, the Torah is called Shira, because there is what is called Kavana Shniya. There are secondary associations from these Lashonos. By the way, the Baal Shem Tov just says generally about the union of Chalitza. It's an amazing thing. The Baal Shem Tov says that we know that one of the halachas of Avelos is an Avel has to be without shoes. So essentially, the Yavama says to the Yavam, sit shiva for your brother. You've killed your brother a second time. Your brother died. You had a chance to perpetuate his neshama. You refuse? Take off your shoes. Like an Ilas, a sandal, is like the brother dying a second time. Of course, I raised the kasha earlier, that l'chayra, the chalitza ritual is hard to understand when it's not the brother. As if the brother says, I don't want to do it, all right, so, she spits in front of him, etc. But the halacha is, if he wants and she doesn't want, we also do chalitza. And among Ashkenazim, you'll recall the Ramah's halacha is, we don't even allow Yibam even if they both want. And the Yavam is not even married, so there's no problem of Rabbeinu Gershom's ban. They both want to do Yibam. We don't allow it. And we still make the man go through Chalitza. I mean, that's what the Torah says. So men can't win. I mean, no matter what it is. So I don't know. I probably don't understand exactly the logic of the ritual, but this is the Gzeres HaKosav, that Chalitza has to be done, even if the Meniya is mitzad the woman, and even if the halacha says you can't do, you can't. In fact, there are cases where even before the Ramah, there are cases where you're not allowed to have Yibam. I mean, the Gemara says, for example, Alman ol Kayin Gadol, I mentioned. Let's say a Kohen Hedjot marries a woman. The Kohen Hedjot dies. She's now a widow. His brother happens to be a Kohen Gadol. He's not allowed to marry a widow. And I can't even say the Asay of Yibam is Docha, the Lo Sasa of marrying a widow, because marrying a widow is a Lo Sasa and an Asay. The Torah says a Kohen Gadol cannot marry an Almana, and he can only marry a virgin. So an Asay could override a negative, but an Asay cannot override a negative and a positive. So the halacha is, he is not allowed to do Yibam. So what happens? He must give her Chalitza. So I don't want to be a skeptic or not be cursed or anything. I'm just saying that the Taina, that we spit at him, she spits at him and says, so shall be done to the man who does not want to rebuild his brother's home. It's a little shver that he has to go through that ritual when the halacha says he's not even allowed to be miyabim. But okay, I mean these are questions, but they don't. The bottom line is very, very, very clear. And chalitza is essentially a certain disparagement of the brother. Asher lo yivnes beis achiv. Could be in Ruchnius. There's a concept that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu arranged your life that you're not going to be able to do this mitzvah, that's a pagam. It's strange. Even though you're a Kohen Gadol, you would think that that's the greatest covet. And yet, if this disables you from being able to be baina, then it means you didn't care enough. Somehow things would have worked out. Who knows? And Ruchnius, these different calculations. Okay, so the idea, though, that what Bayaz is doing is Yibam is very, very clear in the narrative, because it mentions that when Bayaz and Ruth have a son that they call Oved, and Oved is the father of Yishai, who's the father of David, so it talks about the neighbors. It's almost as if Ruth was a surrogate mother for Naomi. It says, the Shechenais, the neighbors, said, Yulad ben Naomi. A child has been born to Naomi, and Naomi raises the child. This may have been, once again, an example of the tzidkus of Ruth HaMoaviyah, that she kind of let the bubby almost become the main mother, because this was for Naomi almost a reincarnation, a Gilgal of sorts. Mekubalim say it's a Gilgal of her son Machlin. And that's why it's Yulad ben Naomi. This is Naomi's son. Again, that's a confirmation that we're talking about Yibam. spiritual Yibam, even if it's not technical Yibam. Okay, so that's the basic story, and again, I hope it clarifies things, because again, as I say, people read the psukim, and they just don't really know what's going on, and the Torah Shebaal Peh gives us a lot of information that we otherwise wouldn't automatically gather from the text itself. Now, the final thing I want to talk about, okay, I'll just begin it, and then I'll talk about it tomorrow. That'll be our last shir on Ruth, is what you might call the very murky, dark, strange origins of Malchus Beis David and the Messianic line. All sorts of things seem to involve Averos, or quasi-Averos, or near Averos, or misunderstandings that Averos are taking place. And this applies on every sign of the lineage of Yichus that you have. Let's go back. The end of Ruth gives you a Yichus starting from Yehuda. Right? Elder told us, right? Now, remember the story of Yehuda and Tamar. That's in the Chumash itself, right? Yehuda had 3 sons, Er, Onan, Shelah, and a woman, Tamar, who some say was the daughter of Shem ben Noach, a righteous woman from a righteous family. She married Er, and it mentions that Er did evil in the eyes of God. Doesn't say what he did exactly, and God killed him. So the next brother, Onan, married, and as the Ramban pointed out, even Kaidam Matan Torah, there was a concept of Yibum to perpetuate. Now for Onan, it does say what it says. Onan saw that it would not be his child, because it would be like Er's child, so he spilt his seed, meaning he was mashchis zera arza, and therefore he too did evil, and God killed him. Now, even though the Chumash only says the Avera of Onanism, kind of a masturbation, it does not say what the Avera of Er was, but in fact Chazal understand that Er and Aina were guilty of the same sin, albeit for maybe different reasons. Er was also mashchesera because he didn't want to mar her beauty by a pregnancy. Onan was mashchesera because he felt the child wouldn't be his child. But be it as it may, according to Chazal, what is called Maise Er V'Onan is a kinoi for Hashchasas Zera Levatala. So Er died, Onan died. So there's a third son who's in line for Yibam, pre-Matan Torah Yibam, and that is Shelah. But Yehuda did not want Shelah, his son, to marry Tamar. Why didn't he want that to happen? Because he thought Tamar was a high-risk wife. She already killed 2 husbands. And there is a category in halacha even called katlanis, if a woman not caused, but if marriage to the woman resulted in 2 deaths, halachically she really should not marry other people. Now, this is even nogea l'maisa. In fact, I'll tell you a recent situation I was literally involved in, and you'll see how Paiskim have to make exceptions for different situations. This was a woman who lost her first husband when he was in his 50s, so he died young, and she remarried a second person who was already 70s, and he died of a heart condition, and now she wants to marry a third person. So the question is, she lost 2 husbands. Is she a katlanis that's considered to be dangerous? So the poskim basically say that if she marries, like pre-existing conditions, if she marries a person with existing health problems, or some say bichlal, if the person died in his 70s or 80s. I mean, someone's going to die at some point. We're not machzikir as a katlanis. Katlanis is only if there is what you might call unexpected deaths. That would not be usual. So then we're choshesh that the mazel is bad or whatever it is, and she shouldn't marry because of sakana. So Yehuda held that Tamar was a katlanis. So again, I'll just throw out an interesting question. Given the fact that Aaron Einan died because of Averos, then bichlal, why would there be any katlanis at all? I mean, I just told you she marries a guy with a heart condition. That doesn't make her a katlanis. So if she married somebody who died because of an Aveira that Hashem said you're Chayav Misa for, that shouldn't be Katlanis either. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Yehuda didn't know why they died. So Mamela, he was Machzikr B'Katlanis. Or maybe, for Keret, he was Choshesh, that if Er was Nichshal and Onan was Nichshal, maybe Shayla would be Nichshal, and she's a Katlanis, that if you do that Aveira, you're going to die. In other words, that could be factored in to the Katlanis Cheshbon again. So Yehuda did not want to allow Shayla, but the interesting is, so Tamar remained a living widow. So, going back to the Chumash itself, maybe we'll talk about it tomorrow. I mean, l'chayra, how can Yehuda have it both ways? Yehuda's shita is she cannot marry his son. Can she marry anybody? I mean, l'chayra, Katlanis, she can't marry anybody. So, isn't there some equivalent of chalitza? Like, in other words, what did you do pre-Matan Torah? If you were doing some type of yibum, and the yavam didn't want to be miyabim or couldn't be miyabim, she just remained like stuck? That seems a little unfair. I mean, there ought to be some type of release ceremony. So that's one question to think about. And the other question will be Yehuda himself, and Yehuda and Tamar, etc. So we'll talk about that tomorrow.